Well, that happened. Welcome to 2026, I guess. But as we wait for the fog to clear on the first major geopolitical midweek surprise of the new year, I think it's important to look back a bit and evaluate a bit more about 2025. To say it was an eventful year from a military and geopolitical standpoint would be a heck of an understatement. And so what I thought we'd do to kick off 2026, just as we did at the start of 2025, was to scan through the last 12 months of major events and try and pick out a major strategic winner and strategic loser of the year that just was. As some of you might remember last year, we gave the Strategic Winner of the Year award to the small South American nation of Guyana, a nation which had discovered rich oil deposits, was seeing its economy grow at a breakneck pace, and which managed to navigate a complex security situation despite not having much in the way of its own defences. And while they're not eligible for the top spot again this year, I think it's fair to say the nation still looks to be on a fairly decent track. Economic growth is projected to be something like 23 to 24% in 2026, and the nation's primary perceived regional security threat, Venezuela, is looking like they might at least be a tad distracted for the immediate future. In any case then, what we'll be doing today is looking at some of the world's other major strategic stories in 2025, and trying, albeit in a very loose and subjective sense, to try and identify who in strategic terms came out on top, and who might be hoping that their strategic luck turns around a bit in the new season. To do that, I'll set some ground rules about what countries are considered eligible and how you assess a strategic winner versus a strategic loser, and then talk you through my nominations for the strategic podium, the wooden spoon, and one or two cases that didn't make the list for various reasons, which I very much think shouldn't be forgotten. In saying that, I'll just make the reminder that even though this is meant to be a bit more of a light-hearted episode, keep in mind that behind all of this, we're talking about dramatic international events that shape literally millions of lives. So as we go through some examples of good, bad, or occasionally terribly bad strategy, please keep in mind the people who find themselves stuck in the middle of it. With that said, let me welcome you all to 2026, and for the first time this year, throw over to a returning sponsor. While it might be fantastic if 2026 saw major international events hitting us with a little less frequency than 2025, somehow I'm not confident. And in that kind of frenetic news environment, even just passing the headlines can be difficult enough, especially when you account for what different news organisations might or might not choose to put front and centre. Looking at reports covering negotiations over the war in Ukraine, for example, this headline suggests that Ukraine might be willing to drop its long-held ambition to join Nato. While these ones elevate different context, like the fact that concession would reportedly be contingent on Ukraine receiving alternative security guarantees from Europe and Washington instead. The tool being used to sweep between headlines here is ground news. By drawing on news sources around the world, it doesn't just allow you to quickly compare headlines or prepare curated feeds, it can also provide valuable context, think things like ownership information for the sources you're seeing. And ground news is really a tool that you can use in a way that fits what you're trying to do. Maybe you want to hone in on specific topics, or you might want to deploy a tool like the blind spot feed, which might surface stories that are mostly being covered in the kind of news media you might not ordinarily consume. That might not mean they're fantastic sources, but I think it can be handy to understand what different parts of the internet might be seeing. There may not be a silver bullet for challenges like online echo chambers, but the right tool might help. There's a reason Ground News has been this channel's longest running sponsor. And so if you're interested, the link in the description will give you access to a 40% discount on the Vantage plan, which is the one I use, giving you access to the full range of Ground News features. And with that said, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's set some ground rules first. What are we actually grading here? Because this is ultimately a deeply subjective exercise, and a dozen different commentators could easily come up with half a dozen different lists, depending on what they chose to emphasise. For my part, I wanted the list to be relatively broad, so to be eligible, it has to have been a country that I covered on the channel at least somewhat over the course of 2025, but not one that regularly gets its own detailed episodes or is likely to have one in the near future. We talk enough regularly about the likes of Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, so I didn't want them to make a repeat appearance here. Then, to work out who among those eligible countries actually ends up on the podium, I'm going with two relative defence and strategic focused measures. Firstly, is that nation's defence and strategic position better or worse than it was at the start of the year? And secondly, how well did it arguably perform relative to the strategic hand that had been dealt? Norway doesn't get points for ending the year as a rich and stable country, for example, because it just is a super rich and stable country, and it would take truly incompetent leadership or some major outside force to change that. In essence, I want to look both at how the year turned out for these countries, and also just how well they played the hand of strategic cards they were dealt. Ground rules set, let's get into the countries that did or didn't make it to the top or bottom of the list. Before we deliver the coveted Perun Strategic Wooden Spoon Award for 2025 though, I just want to spare a quick word for some of the truly horrendous conflicts and situations around the world, that perhaps don't tend to get as much media coverage, and for various reasons under those rules we just established, aren't going to find themselves getting a detailed call out today. The war in Sudan, for example, was ruled out for 2 reasons. We didn't do an episode on it in 2025, and it deserves a detailed study, which it's going to be getting in 2026. But if the main criteria was raw humanitarian tragedy, few, if any, conflict stories around the world would be able to compete, and I didn't want us to see 2025 pass out of the rearview mirror without calling out some of what's happened there. As of April 2025, so months before some of the major events of the year, like the fall of the city of Al-Fasher and the humanitarian disaster that followed, the estimates you can see on the right there were that nearly 13 million Sudanese had already been forcibly displaced. About 25 million were facing acute hunger, and more than 600,000 famine. And with the country now roughly rent in two between the Rapid Support Forces and their allied groups and the Sudanese army and their supporters, it seems deeply unlikely that this is a war that's going to end tomorrow. But if Sudan is a story of ongoing humanitarian tragedy that I think needs to be told in 2026, amidst decidedly intense competition, the strategic wooden spoon for 2025 is instead going to go to a country one continent over, perhaps unsurprisingly, to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, you might be asking, Perun, why Iran? And a big part of it, I'd argue, is that in 2025, you had countries with economic crises, ecological crises, military defeats, and diplomatic reverses. But it's a much shorter list of countries that managed to accumulate the full set. And so in Iran's case, I want to work through a bunch of these in sequence. Starting with the military dimension. What did Tehran achieve militarily in 2025, and what did it cost them? At the start of 2025, Iran and Israel weren't yet in an open, all-out shooting war. Iran's proxies and allies in the region had taken a significant battering, sure, but strikes against Iran itself were limited to a couple of main waves of Israeli strikes, while Iran launched a number of large but intermittent missile attacks against Israel proper. Given the scale of some of these attacks, calling them tit-for-tat strikes would probably be overly dismissive, but in a military sense, they were largely punctuated discrete events, rather than a continuous rolling campaign of attacks in either direction. There was also a lot of doubt internationally about how things would play out if the situation did escalate. How would Iran's missile arsenal field against Israeli defences? How effective would Israel be in being able to project force into Iran proper? The article I have on the right there from Foreign Policy back in 2021 illustrates some of the ambiguity amongst analysts here. It contended that Israel attacking Iran directly wasn't possible because, frankly, the IDF wasn't up to the task. And as long as the situation didn't escalate to direct kinetic conflict, that level of uncertainty would persist. Unfortunately for Iran, though, in the middle of 2025, the situation did escalate. We got a bunch of empirical data about the actual balance of military capability, and while the data set was a bit of a mixed bag in places, something that came through fairly clearly was a deep imbalance between Iran's long-range offensive and defensive capabilities. The Israelis had an air force capable of launching strikes into Iran proper, and one of the world's most advanced integrated air and missile defense systems. Iran had one of the world's largest ballistic missile arsenals capable of reaching Israel, but its air defense system, based on a number of aging aircraft and Russian air defense systems, wasn't exactly up to the task. It was a military investment picture that was very much all spear, no shield, the consummate glass cannon from an air and missile warfare perspective. And I'd argue that came through fairly clearly in the way we saw the so-called 12-day war play out. In particular, we've gotten more confirmation that the expenditure of Israeli and American interceptors to shoot down incoming Iranian ballistic missiles was very high and incredibly expensive. In September, it was reported that US budget documents had requested roughly $500 million to replace just the THAAD interceptors that had been fired by the United States in defense of Israel. That is a roughly $500 million bill to replace just one of the higher interceptor systems used. And if some of the public estimates of somewhere between 100 and 150 THAAD interceptors actually being fired in the course of the effort turned out to be true, then at recent pricing, $500 million wouldn't actually be enough for a full replacement. Add in other interceptor systems, especially the expensive ones like Arrow or SM-3, and it seems likely the Iranians were able to achieve a shot exchange cost efficiency ratio that was very much in their favour. They were spending less on the missiles that were being fired than the Israelis and Americans were spending to shoot them down. It's also notable that as the missile attacks went on, the penetration rate appeared to increase, from a single-digit percentage of leakage at the start to a low double-digit number later on. Different analysts have suggested at least 3 factors that might have gone into that. The Iranians deploying more of their advanced, more expensive systems over time that were better at getting through the missile defense systems, the steady depletion of interceptors on the defending side, and potentially connected to that previous point, a decision by the Israelis as the conflict went on to get more picky about what missiles had interceptors fired against them and which ones they let land. And for those missiles they did choose to engage, whether they fired multiple interceptors against it to maximise the probability of a hit, or tried to economise on interceptors by playing the odds and only firing one. Part of the problem from an Iranian perspective, I'd argue, though, is that shot exchange doesn't win wars by itself, far from it. It can be relevant, but only if it's sustainable, repeatable, if both sides have broadly equivalent resources, and most importantly, that there isn't some other aspect of the conflict that makes the issue redundant or at least less important. On the resource side, sure, the interception effort might have been more expensive than the Iranian missile campaign itself, but the United States finding $500 million for new interceptors is a very different proposition than Iran finding $200 million for new missiles. It's also critically true that the missile campaign wasn't the only part of the war that was playing out. What those Iranian missile launchers were able to do is saturate Israeli defences, expend a lot of interceptors, and leak through a number of missiles that did score hits. What that missile campaign very much wasn't able to do was either prevent Israel launching air attacks against Iran proper, or inflict so much damage that it forced the Israelis to back off. From a defence economic standpoint, this was one of the more interesting dynamics of the conflict. Even once you account for the flight hours and tanker sorties, it's just cheaper and more effective to truck a couple of PGMs on an F-15 or F-16 than it is to comparatively less accurately yeet them using a medium-range ballistic missile. And so we saw the Iranians lose a lot of military capacity that had been built up over a long period of time and at great cost, without achieving an enormous amount with it relative to that cost. Just based on the visual evidence we have, we know the Iranians lost air defence systems, aircraft, radars, production facilities, the hundreds of missiles they fired against the Israelis, additional missiles that were destroyed on the ground, and a significant chunk of their transporter erector launchers, their TELs. The basic gist here is that as a result of the campaign, the Iranian missile force going into 2026 is likely significantly smaller and less capable than it was going into 2025. And for that, they achieved some tactical wins, successfully hitting Israel, but much less in a strategic sense. An interesting comparison here might be the Houthi effort in the Red Sea. Based on what the Houthis said, the goal of that campaign seems to have been to interdict civilian traffic through the Red Sea and the Bab al-Mandeb, nominally to build pressure and force the Israelis to end their operations in Gaza. At a tactical and operational level, I'd argue they succeeded. Red Sea shipping transits collapsed in 2024 and stayed depressed through 2025. That was the case despite the US and allied navies intervening directly, in some cases launching direct strikes against the Houthis themselves. But strategically, I'd argue, the effort pretty much failed. The Israelis continued for almost 2 years after the Houthi attack started, despite the resources that were expended and the weapons that Iran was allegedly able to supply. And from Tehran's perspective, many of its proxies and allies in the region arguably aren't in the best shape they've ever been. Hezbollah in Lebanon still exists, but militarily as a weaker version of its former self, facing pressures and deadlines to be disarmed south of the Litani River, and despite the 2024 ceasefire, fairly regular Israeli strikes. Hamas in Gaza has resisted efforts to force it to finally disarm, but it too is almost certainly militarily weaker in January 2026 than it was in January 2025, albeit at tremendous cost to the civilian population of Gaza. And Iran's regional supply routes to support some of these groups also broke down in 2025, with Damascus flipping from an Iranian ally to staunch critic, and the country attempting to exercise more control over its own territory and borders. And then there was the nuclear program. And how you evaluate this dimension really comes down, I think, to how you answer two questions. Diplomatically, is there anything the Iranians could have done to avoid American intervention, and how much damage did that intervention actually do? Given the degree of apparent vacillation we saw from Washington, D.C., I don't think it's reasonable to argue that the US strikes were inevitable. And based on some of the imagery and evidence that's come out subsequently about the effect of Operation Midnight Hammer, I think it's reasonable to say that those strikes probably hurt the Iranian nuclear program, and that in two respects, it ends 2025 in a worse place than it was at the start. There are still a lot of unknowns, for example, the location of Iran's stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, but it does appear that most, if not all of Iran's nuclear sites took at least some damage. Various comments and estimates by the IAEA indicate their belief that many of the impacted sites were significantly damaged, that the enriched uranium remained at those sites, and that, at least based on satellite evidence, the IAEA hasn't seen any evidence of renewed enrichment. None of that means Iran can't resume enrichment, potentially do it in secret, or assemble atomic bombs. But from an industrial perspective, it's a harder proposition, and especially a harder proposition to do rapidly and at scale than it was before these attacks happened. At the same time, I'd argue from Tehran's perspective, the risks and costs of pushing forward went up. The US has indicated fairly publicly and directly that if they see evidence of Iran building up its nuclear capabilities again, more strikes might be forthcoming. That would suggest that, hypothetically, Iran wouldn't just have to solve the problem of building up a nuclear arsenal, it would have to do it as rapidly and secretly as possible before a strike campaign could be launched to set the program back again. And while the Iranian nuclear program might be further away from giving them a steady production line of atomic bombs on tap, what it did appear to give them was more sanctions. In September, the UN Security Council triggered the so-called snapback provision, essentially a full range of international sanctions that had been suspended under the old Iran nuclear agreement now snapped back into force, leaving Iran's nuclear program at the end of 2025 arguably a dangerous combination of more secretive, damaged, and more expensive. The snapback sanctions and the way the war played out were also, I'd argue, illustrations of the limits of Iran's diplomatic strategy. In recent years, we'd seen Tehran make a number of major diplomatic plays. They extended their friendship with Beijing, made a major roll of the dice with Moscow, supplying weapons and drone designs to them early in the Ukraine war, and also, in a major shift for regional dynamics, reached out to old adversaries, the Saudis. Representatives from both sides have repeatedly met, and we've seen plenty of diplomatic moments, like the one you can see on the right there from just a couple of weeks ago, with representatives from Iran and Saudi Arabia sitting down, along with China. All of this is arguably valuable from an Iranian perspective. Anything that punctures their degree of international isolation is potentially strategically useful. But 2025, I'd argue, showed some of the limits of this approach. Tehran might have been making moves and gains, but they also weren't the only party manoeuvring. On the Saudi front, for example, as we discussed in 2024, something that potentially works in Tehran's interest is attempting to drive a wedge between Riyadh and Washington. One element we've seen that's helped widen that wedge at times is US insistence on Saudi-Israeli normalisation, something which arguably became practically impossible after October 2023 and the Israeli actions that followed. What Iran might have been hoping for then is that the United States would continue to push Riyadh to normalise with Israel, the Saudis would predictably refuse, tensioning the relationship, and leaving more of a diplomatic opening for Tehran and friends. Instead, what we saw was 2025 end with a major new US-Saudi agreement. A new security and cooperation pact was signed, and for the first time, Washington designated Saudi Arabia a major non-NATO ally, MNNA. That has major potential implications for the Saudi military's relationship with the United States, its access to cutting-edge technology and weapon systems, and reportedly, Saudi F-35s are very much now on the cards. One of those rare examples of an international development where both the Israelis and the Iranians are unhappy with the news. With the crux of the issue here being the Americans were willing to proceed with the new agreement, despite the Saudis not really budging on the Israel issue. Riyadh has basically said that normalisation is a thing that could potentially, hypothetically, maybe happen at some uncertain point in the future following a two-state solution and the recognition of a Palestinian state, and Washington basically going, sure, sounds good enough, do you want to buy some weapons? And just as we saw that relationship between Riyadh and Washington grow stronger, at least on paper, the security value of Iran's own diplomatic relationships and friendships was probably revised down. Going into 2025, and especially since 2022, Iran had, for example, invested a lot in its friendship with Russia. There had been lots of promises of friendship and brotherhood, cooperation on things like sanction busting, and famously the transfer of weapon systems and the IP behind them that came to underpin parts of the Russian drone campaign. What wasn't clear going into 2025 is how much Iran's nominal friends would actually do if the country found itself in a security crisis. That uncertainty might have created some deterrence value. If you were Israel, for example, and you weren't sure what Moscow or Beijing would do if you decided to take direct kinetic action against the Iranian homeland, that might be a reason to potentially hesitate. When the Israeli Air Force actually pulled the trigger, though, that uncertainty evaporated, and it became clear that the relationship between Tehran and Moscow was less brothers in arms and more towards the thoughts and prayers end of the spectrum. That doesn't mean those diplomatic relationships are useless from the Iranian perspective. They still need markets like China for their energy exports, investors, technical assistance, potential weapons suppliers. But from a security and deterrence perspective, I think it's hard to argue that 2025 didn't see the value of some of those relationships, especially with Moscow, revised down a bit. Something which might be worrying if you're a leader like Maduro in Venezuela, for example, and have just been watching how things played out in late 2024 and 2025 for Russian allies like Syria and Iran. And future Perun note here, I'm very deliberately going to leave that section in, but suffice to say, yeah, that turned out to be a tad more immediately relevant than I'd originally intended. But here's the thing. If this episode was just about defence outcomes, I don't think Iran would be number one on the list. The 12-day war and Midnight Hammer was expensive from an Iranian perspective, but not decisive. Instead, the reason I moved Tehran to the top of this list is because as much damage as the Israelis were able to do, for example, to the Iranian military, it absolutely paled in comparison to how much damage the Iranian government itself has been able to do to the Iranian everything else. With the country now locked in the midst of a water crisis, economic crisis, and political crisis all in one. Even for those of you from countries that are familiar with the idea of water shortages, the situation in Iran got pretty dire in 2025. Amidst a drought that might have been the worst for 40 years, the city of Mashhad saw its reserves drop below 3% capacity, while the taps were repeatedly turned off in the capital Tehran, and the president of Iran openly described moving the capital to an area further in the south, closer to the Gulf, where water might be more available. Even in a very arid country, it's not easy to get to the point where your water crisis is so bad that you're considering moving your capital, or where, again, according to the president, the depletion of underground water reserves is in some places causing the land to sink. With the president saying, quote, "In some areas, the land is subsiding by up to 30 centimetres per year. This is a disaster and shows that the water beneath our feet is running out," end quote. For a country with Iran's resources, that's not a level of dire you can usually achieve overnight. And instead, it's required persistent and almost comical levels of mismanagement that, if you didn't know better from the outside looking in, look dangerously close to sabotage. A major problem, for example, is the cumulative effect of decades of dubious mismanagement and strategic decisions. Iran, for example, long ago made the decision to be maximally independent when it comes to agricultural production. That might sound great on the tin, but it means the country, which struggles for water resources, produces large amounts of water-intensive crops. Couple that with underinvestments in irrigation systems that are often aging, very leaky, and lead to lots of water being lost to evaporation. It probably doesn't take a genius to suggest that you probably shouldn't be growing things like rice or sugarcane, but in places, Iran is. For reasons, in 2024, Iran was the 19th largest sugar producer in the world, totaling about 1.8 million metric tons, or about 1% of all global production. Oh, and here's an article in Iranian media about the government essentially bragging about the further expansion of rice cultivation in the country, with the agricultural ministry saying that 650,000 hectares are now being used for rice production, with the country planning to produce about 2.5 million tonnes of the stuff in the current calendar year. Per the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, Iran's current plan is to continue dialing up agricultural production by an annual rate of about 5.5%, with the end target being, quote, "at least 90% self-sufficiency in essential commodities and food items," end quote. Again, food security and independence is a very understandable and quite a common strategic goal, but Tehran appears to be executing on that concept with a surprising focus on some famously water-intensive crops, often with a production efficiency in terms of water used per crop generated that's abysmal by international standards. In many cases, for example, there hasn't been enough investment in the irrigation infrastructure or the farming practices, and so enormous amounts of water can be lost to things like evaporation and inefficiency. One, as an Australian, that's horrifying, and two, it de facto means that Iran is in some ways actually a water exporting country, because in some cases they take their domestic water resources, convert those into water-intensive crops, and then actually export those. Investment in Iran has often focused on trying to find more water for agriculture rather than saving it. Think less boring things like effective irrigation infrastructure and farming practices, and more dams, and more dams. Following the revolution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps got pretty deeply involved in the dam construction business. Because, revolutionaries and military personnel are famously known for their knowledge of water conservation, ecological processes, and dam construction. The country then went on a massive dam building binge that had basically no breaks. Per Penelope Mitchell, a geographer at the University of Alabama, Iran was actually one of the top 3 dam builders in the world in the later part of the 20th century, with many of those dams being built on rivers that were, for example, too small to sustain them, and actually ended up increasing water loss due to evaporation rather than solving the water supply issue. Over the years, Iran effectively destroyed some of its own agricultural areas and ramped up the pressure on its underground water resources. Today, some of those dams have proven wasteful, now being effectively empty, while others have been actively destructive. One somewhat infamous example of this process was the so-called Gotvan Dam, which is basically just one giant facepalm in economic project form. To somewhat oversimplify the story, as you can see from some of the images on the right there, the proposed dam location was very close to the so-called Gachsaran Evaporite Formation. Think huge formations that contained an absolute shit ton of solid form salt. The concern then being, if you build a dam there and cause the water level to rise, over time, that salt is going to dissolve into the water, salinating the reservoir and then flowing downstream. Some might suggest that a sane person in that scenario would either just not build the dam or at least build it further upstream, away from those salt reserves, so that the reservoir builds up behind them and they don't become a problem. The Iranian government, however, appears to have gone with a bit of a YOLO approach, built the dam anyway. To the shock of everyone apparently, the salt began to dissolve, leading to a very saline reservoir. With this piece written in 2023 by authors including some from Iranian universities, stating that, quote, "This dam is known as one of the worst engineering failures in Iran's history because its impoundment submerged the enormous salty unit of the GEF, outcropped into the reservoir, leading to reservoir water salination in deep layers up to several times greater than that in the high seas." End quote. Basically, the Iranians managed to take a freshwater river and dam it to the point where the deep layers of the reservoir behind the dam were saltier than the bloody ocean. Now, of course, that doesn't actually mean the dam is useless for providing water or other applications, but it is, to put it mildly, distinctly suboptimal. This was not an unforeseeable problem. As one engineer who worked on dams in Iran in the 70s remarked, quote, "We had done the research for the area around the Gotvan Dam in the 1970s, and that's why the dam wasn't built then. We knew it would directly affect the salt concentration of the water, the numbers, the research was all there, but they built it anyway." End quote. And to add policy insult to the injury of the entire thing, one of the main motivations for building the dam in the first place was to supply sugarcane plantations. Now, Gotvan was a construction project from the 1990s, so you might wonder why I'm bringing it up in a video set in 2025. The answer is because despite the potential lessons of Gotvan and other dam construction projects, the IRGC and the dam construction business rolled on regardless. And in 2023, the Iranians inducted a new hydroelectric dam at Shamshir that was reportedly funded using a, quote, high-interest $244 million loan from China, end quote, and was built only about 250 kilometres away from the Gotvan project, on an extensive bed of gypsum and salt. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that malinvestment might be part of the problem here, but there are two other M's to consider as well: mismanagement and malincentives. On the mismanagement side, short of rainfall and water in its dams, Iran has just been overtapping its groundwater reserves to a truly insane degree. Reportedly, according to the Iranian government itself, as far back as 2019, there were already 470,000 legal and 320,000 illegal wells in the country. The government claimed to be sealing between 13,000 and 14,000 illegal wells per year, but that wasn't enough to keep up with the growth, let alone dial back the problem. Reportedly, in many areas, groundwater extraction rates are about 2 to 3 times higher than what the land can actually sustain. According to the study on the right there, Iran is home to 32 of the world's 50 most overpumped aquifers. Hence the case we can see collapses in existing aquifers, and situations where, as mentioned earlier, you can start to see the ground begin to sink. Not by a little bit, but up to 30 centimetres per year. What none of that has stopped, though, is the Iranian government and the IRGC continuing to back water-intensive industries. Not just agriculture that consumes a majority of what's available, but water-intensive industry that consumes a lot of what's left. And that catastrophic level of water overuse is partly a result of malincentives, the rules the Iranian government itself has put in place. Despite being a rare and valuable resource for them, water in the country is kept very, very cheap, not just for residential drinking, cleaning and cooking, but also for agricultural and industrial purposes. There's an old economic saying that you show me the incentive and I'll show you the behaviour, and in Iran, the economic incentive when it comes to water is often basically use it or someone else will. To cap it all off, it's looking more and more like the American withdrawal from Afghanistan might turn out to make the water situation for the Iranians even worse. To simplify the situation, Iran and Afghanistan had a long-standing agreement governing the supply of water from rivers that run through Afghanistan into Iran. The Taliban, in what I'm sure is a massive surprise to all of you listening, apparently don't care overly much about those kind of agreements. They have their own water shortages and dire economic situation to worry about, and so they've gone ahead and built an additional dam, allowing them to harness more of those water resources while reducing the flow into Iran. Perhaps not enough to move the needle at a grand strategic scale normally, but in the context of an Iran that was already under intense water pressure, this has become yet another continuing point of tension. The long story short of this is that towards the end of 2025, the water situation for Iranian residents in a lot of the country's major cities became acute. There were reportedly times in the capital, Tehran, where the city at once had both no electrical power and also no water coming through the taps. Not ideal in a situation where people are also dealing with soaring temperatures. Water supplies for both residential and industrial use had to be repeatedly throttled. And despite December seeing a surge in rain after a protracted drought, even that seems to have come in a somewhat unhelpful way. Instead of a protracted period of moderate rain falling helpfully over reservoirs, Iran got floods. Homes were flooded, thousands of people required rescue services. And yet despite that, overall reservoir levels in many cases remain catastrophically low. Iranian media, for example, reported in late December that one of the main reservoirs supplying Tehran, with a total capacity of 205 million cubic metres of water, contained only 6 million cubic metres, about 3% of its capacity. In summary then, in 2025, Iran's water problem went from bad to critical, to the point where, as mentioned, the country's president openly touted the idea of moving the country's capital from Tehran further south. And unfortunately for Iran's people and its economy, water wasn't the only thing the country was growing ever shorter on. An arid country like Iran being short on water is something that might be understandable if avoidable. Less easy to intuitively process is why a country with massive reserves of oil and gas would also have rolling power shortages. In recent years, power cuts had reportedly become a bit of a common feature of Iran both during the summer and winter months, but in 2025, things generally got worse. And in what I'm sure is a major surprise to all of you, the story behind the why here mirrors the water story fairly closely. Firstly, you start with a potentially understandable malincentive. In Iran, electricity is kept artificially cheap. On one hand, that helps make it more affordable for lower-income households, but it also helps strip away the economic disincentive against just using as much of the stuff as possible. One estimate I saw was that energy consumption in Iran has been growing at an annual rate of about 7% per year. And because power is so cheap, you see a bunch of economic activities pop up that you could argue shouldn't be happening in a country with major power shortages. Iran, for example, became a major hub of crypto mining, and the government has repeatedly complained about the energy demand caused by people setting up crypto mining rigs and then running them off the back of artificially cheap, subsidised electricity. But on a less flagrant scale, it also encourages the development of power-intensive industries that might not actually make economic sense if electricity was accurately valued. Then you have your supply-side issues, where the many problems include, you guessed it, malinvestment and mismanagement. While Iran was investing a lot in its missile, drone and nuclear programs, energy generation capacity was one of the areas that fell behind. The article from Iranian media on the right there includes a claim by Iran's power minister that the country's generating capacity is growing by about 2.2% per year. Unfortunately for Iran's power grid, 2.2% is a smaller number than around 7%. And so you have a situation where capacity just isn't keeping up with demand growth. The water situation doesn't help. Some of Iran's power is generated by hydroelectric dams, which can't generate power if there's no water behind said dam, as do issues with war and degradation in the overall power grid. The Israelis reportedly struck a number of Iranian energy sites during the two countries' brief war, while the logistics, generation and transmission infrastructure just isn't up to where it needs to be for Iran's current state. The results are pretty much what you'd expect. High temperatures, blackouts. Low temperatures, blackouts. Fuel shortages, would you believe it, more blackouts. Interestingly, if you go back to that article I showed just a moment earlier, it includes a statement about the Iranian energy minister apparently basically bragging about the stability of the Iranian power grid, with the article saying, quote, he praised the stability of Iran's power grid, saying that no major blackouts have occurred in the past 22 years, even as countries like Spain and Portugal experienced outages in 2025, end quote. My best guess at what he might potentially be saying there is that unlike some other countries, Iran doesn't have massive surprise blackouts because it's become really good at having regular expected ones. It's certainly not everywhere and it's not all the time, and when conditions are relatively benign, the system can mostly hold it together. But the whole arrangement seems stressed and fragile. But there were cuts in February before the 12-day war, and particularly significant cuts going into July and August. That then has the potential to have economic ripple effects. There are a lot of industries out there, like smelters for example, that don't do very well with an intermittent supply of power. But if the government makes the decision to prioritise supply to the industrial sector, that makes life even harder for the general population. Conventional economics would suggest that in that sort of situation, while you try and work on the supply side, you should attempt to suppress demand. Maybe consider raising the price of electricity in order to encourage consumers and industry to use less of it. But that might not go down so well, given issue number 3. Iran might be short on water and short on power, but it's absolutely not short on inflation. At time of recording, multiple protests have broken out across Iran, partly in response to the deteriorating economic situation, which is a very sanitised way of saying that over the last year, a lot of Iranians have been watching their purchasing power fall off a cliff. By some estimates, over 2025, the Iranian currency lost almost half its value. At the start of the year, by that measure, the rial was about 800,000 to the US dollar. By the end of December, close to 1.4 million to 1. For a country that has to import so many of its essential goods, that kind of depreciation was a recipe for inflation. And coupled with the range of interesting government economic policies, inflation's what we got. Depending on what estimate you take, over the course of 2025, inflation in the country may have totaled somewhere between 40 and 50%. That's economically horrifying, but not necessarily a crisis for a population, as long as wages generally keep up. Except they're not. And for example, we saw the most recent government budget propose a 20% increase in the pension and salaries for many government employees, well short of the magic 40 to 50+%. And even worse for many Iranians, on the other side of the budget, there were also massive proposed tax increases. Against the backdrop of massive inflation and persistent deficits, the government was reportedly looking to raise tax revenues in 2026 by a casual 62%. So with wages going up 20%, inflation at 50%, and taxes increasing by 62%, you can imagine why some in an already economically struggling population might have been a tad miffed. And potentially not helping in that regard is what the Iranian government was apparently looking to fund at the same time as dialing up taxes and cutting real pay. In an overall budget worth roughly $100 billion, about $9 billion was allocated to so-called special projects, an opaque item with very little detail where your guess is as good as mine. But on a completely unrelated note, several foreign sources have assessed that Iran is putting a lot of focus on rebuilding its ballistic missile arsenal after the short war with Israel. Now, from a defence economics perspective, there is a term for doubling down on your ballistic missile arsenal at a time where the economy is melting down around you. It's called having your priorities arse backwards. And yet, Iran does appear to be pulling a bit of a Brezhnev manoeuvre. And we've already seen Iran's president offer to rewrite the proposed budget after it was effectively rejected by their parliament. As to how the Iranian government actually proposes to solve any of these underlying issues with water, power, finances, or inflation, so far it's not entirely clear. The country's central bank chief has resigned, but that won't suddenly strengthen the currency. The budget could be rewritten to increase wages and try and mitigate the effect of inflation, but unless cuts are made in other areas like military equipment purchases or missile production, that runs the risk of just further exacerbating the deficit and driving even more inflation. And so in summary, Iran ends 2025 shorter on water, shorter on power, shorter on money, longer on inflation, militarily diminished, diplomatically isolated, unstable at home, a banking system that's shown signs of being a bit wobbly after one collapsed in October, and a regime security situation that arguably looks a lot weaker than it did a year ago, with protesters out on the streets, and the United States threatening to intervene if those protests are put down with force. And for me, the capstone here is, depending on what assumptions you make, you could argue that many of the economic and strategic decisions that Iran is making often represent the worst of both worlds. The level of military investment the country has been able to sustain clearly hasn't been enough to fully deter or defeat an opponent like Israel, and I think it's deeply unrealistic to expect it could potentially counter a country like the United States. But while it wasn't enough to provide ironclad security, it was enough to provide an additional source of ongoing economic stress. And one wonders how the current strategic situation might have been different if just a fraction of those missiles, or some of that military infrastructure, or some of the resources funneled to various proxies and allied groups over the years, had instead been invested in things like power and water infrastructure. Similarly, Iran's nuclear program appears to be in a bit of an interesting place. We know the country is facing a massive economic price in the form of those snapback sanctions, or the maximum pressure sanctions from the United States, that have been linked to its refusal to sign a new nuclear agreement that would restrict or end its ability to enrich uranium domestically. And yet, while paying the price to protect its ability to enrich uranium, as far as the IAEA can assess, Iran isn't actually enriching uranium, at least not on a detectable scale. The question might be then, what security value does Tehran think it's getting for the significant price that it's currently paying? Of course, none of this is to say that the government in Tehran is in an impossible scenario. Since the Islamic Revolution, the government in Tehran has managed to take more than a few hits and still hold on to power. But if you compare how 2025 ended to how it began, it's been a bit of a rough year. And also arguably just another year of massive wasted potential. This is a country with a young, educated population, advantageous geography, massive natural resources, and yet this is where things are. Where they'll go in 2026 though, only time will tell. But with that somewhat depressing picture out of the way, let's flip things around a bit and talk about arguably a strategic winner. There are plenty of candidates, but given just the weakness of the country's hand going into 2025, in a stunning strategic reversal, after giving the L to Syria under Bashar al-Assad in 2024, I think the new Syria in 2025 is a good candidate for the podium. Technically, we last covered Syria in the absolute closing days of 2024. The fighters of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and various allied groups had just played out the process of throwing out the Assad government in a lightning campaign, relegating the former dictator to an apartment in Moscow, but the country itself to a very uncertain future. As we moved into 2025, there were enormous unknowns, ranging from what on earth actually just happened to what was about to happen next, with the country de facto under the control of a group led by someone who at the time still had a US bounty on their head. And over the 12 months that followed, we've gotten a little bit more clarity on both points. We've learnt a lot more about the military campaign that brought a sudden and dramatic end to Assad's government, including proof that some of the ideas, tactics, techniques and technologies we're seeing demonstrated so effectively in Ukraine are absolutely also present elsewhere, including in Syria. If you look at those images on the right there, you can see features of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's 2024 offensive that wouldn't be that out of place in Ukraine. You can see a command post with multiple screens showing real-time drone footage, enabled by a backbone of hardware and software that seems to lean a lot on commercial components. You can also see an example of a one-way attack drone that was used to give these forces a degree of long-range firepower. If you look at that system on the right, which I believe we saw used against a military academy in Aleppo, sure, it looks significantly less refined than a lot of the systems the Russians or Ukrainians are using, but remember, the Syrians were basically Tony Starking this shit. It wasn't quite being bashed together in a cave from a bunch of scraps, but it may well have been welded together in a shed using whatever they could get their hands on. On one hand, it proved a great degree of ingenuity. On another, it helped explain to at least a small extent why the fighting played out the way it did, while once again serving as a warning, just in case the world hasn't woken up yet, this kind of technology isn't that hard, and going into 2026, we need to be ready for more actors to have access to it in ever greater quantities. But you can argue that from a Syrian perspective going into 2025, as impressive as it may have been, winning a rapid victory at relatively low cost against on paper a much superior force, that may actually have been the easier part of this process. It's one thing to get to Damascus, it's another to rule when you get there. And economically, militarily, even diplomatically, the Syrian state that the new government inherited was an absolute basket case. Long on cautious optimism about the future perhaps, and short on just about everything else. I'm aware that for a lot of people, looking at slabs of economic data is about as dry as the outback in the middle of summer. But I find it pretty hard to look at Syrian economic data covering the 2010 through 2025 period and not experience a deep wave of sadness and almost awe at how bad things got. What you can see on the right there is the World Bank's 2025 macro-financial assessment of the Syrian Republic. And stat after stat showed how effectively 14 years of civil war and Assad's rule had broken down the country. More than half the pre-war population had been displaced, and GDP had dropped by more than 50%, with GDP per capita reaching just $830 per person in 2024. Studies of light emissions suggested an even deeper decline, closer to 83%. Public and private investment into the country had basically collapsed. That matters because investment is in some ways the driver of your future economic activity. If people are building factories, setting up stores, building infrastructure, then that might bode better for your future than if it's all just being driven by consumption. Before the civil war in percentage of GDP terms, Syria had been attracting just slightly less investment than the Middle East North Africa average. Between 2011 and 2022 though, that percentage almost halved. And that's despite the fact that's a percentage of GDP figure and GDP itself more than halved over that same time period. In percentage terms, Syria was attracting less investment than famously stable Libya. And apparently to provide something of a baseline and make sure Syria wasn't the worst on the chart, the World Bank staff apparently included Yemen, which was also in a civil war, under a blockade, and being actively bombed by foreign powers at the time. These and other stats demonstrate pretty clearly that going into 2025, there were those things the new Syrian government did have, and those it didn't. It didn't have a lot of oil production. Overall output had collapsed to a fraction of its pre-war levels over the course of the civil war, and only 11% of what was left was controlled by Damascus, the rest by other groups. So the coalition Damascus only had 11% of the oil, but with 77% of the population, they did have plenty and plenty of poverty. About 2/3 of the population was living below the so-called lower middle income poverty line. That's $3.65 a day in 2017 purchasing power parity terms. A significant chunk of those, about a quarter of the population overall, were actually below the even lower low-income country international poverty line of $2.15 a day. The list very much went on. The currency had collapsed from about 47 Syrian pounds to the dollar in 2010 to about 15,000 pounds to the dollar at the end of 2024. Sanctions, war and internal displacements had strangled the economy. The shape of the labour force had changed, with about half of people now working for themselves or family business to try and scratch something together as the regular economy imploded. Oh, and to top it all off, mismanagement and corruption had more or less hollowed out many of the institutions of state. Parts of the military and Assad's family were openly involved in the drug trade, with Syria becoming a de facto narco-state, responsible for the production of a stunning 80% of the world's Captagon. The bureaucracy was rife with nepotism, favouritism and corruption, and this stunning economic and political challenge was now pretty much being placed under the control of a group of people who, for the most part, were long on experience in asymmetric warfare, but short on economics degrees. The reason I bring all this up is to say it would have been a pretty unsurprising outcome if all of this had fallen apart relatively quickly, or at least the process stalled out. And that's before we get into the geopolitics of this all, because the new HTS coalition faced challenges on just about every political and diplomatic front. The Russian military still had troops and bases in the country, had formally backed Assad, and launched strikes on HTS and places they controlled in the past. As much as HTS might have said they'd rebranded, their background credentials weren't exactly straight out of central casting if your goal was to get a good reception in Washington. Also, Israeli troops had occupied Syrian territory, and the IAF had struck targets across Syria. There were ground incursions in the south, internal instability, immense sectarian tensions with some outbreaks of violence, and a whole array of international sanctions that on paper targeted Syria, not the Assad government itself, that remained in effect despite the change in management. The new government had basically drawn the 2-7 offsuit of strategic hands, but they then proceeded to play that hand incredibly smart and incredibly hard. One way to start winning points at home and abroad then was to go after that Captagon trade that the previous regime had protected and indeed sort of run. The report on the right there by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime notes that since December 2024, the new government claims to have destroyed 15 industrial-level production facilities in Syria, as well as 13 smaller ones, as well as stockpiles and shipments. The trade is obviously ongoing, and as the UN organisation notes, in some ways that's to be expected. Quote, "It's been suggested, though this information remains unverified, that before December 2024, the daily production of Captagon in the Syrian Arab Republic could have been millions of tablets, and that stocks from previous production could possibly sustain supply for a couple of years if not intercepted." End quote. But there is evidence beyond just the government's claims that they have succeeded in crushing a lot of supply and choking off some of the trade, namely free market economics playing out, and the price going up. Quote, "There are signs of Captagon shortages in several destination markets. Prices have reportedly increased in some of the Gulf countries as well as in countries neighbouring the Syrian Arab Republic. Where forensic analysis is available, it indicates the purity of tablets has declined, suggesting there is less Captagon available. All of this information together suggests that Captagon supply in the region has decreased, likely reflecting a combination of reduced production and intensified controls along key trafficking routes." End quote. In other words, there may clearly be a long way to go, but in 2025, Damascus and various other countries appear to have made a significant dent in the problem. And then there was the question of diplomacy. If you want a piece of evidence of just how successful the rebranding has been from insurgents to legitimate government, I think the photo on the right there does a pretty good job of telling the story, with President Ahmed al-Shara succeeding in making the jump from former US prisoner to guest in the Oval Office. President Trump invited Shara to the White House and has repeatedly praised him for being a strong, capable leader. We also got this surreal shot on the right there, with retired US General David Petraeus sharing friendly conversation with the bloke with a discussion during the Concordia Annual Summit in New York. And the impact of this diplomatic offensive has gone well beyond just a couple of photo opportunities and positive statements. In May, the European Union dropped the overwhelming majority of its sanctions on Syria. They also critically dropped restrictions on a range of entities linked to Syria, including perhaps most importantly, the country's central bank. In June, by executive order, the US followed suit, dropping the vast majority of its sanctions on the Syrian state, while also getting rid of that whole $10 million bounty on Shara thing, because presumably it would have been really awkward if he'd been heading to a meeting with some US representatives, only for some bounty hunters to roll in and try and collect. But as we've seen very much with Russia and other cases, sanctions are often only one part of the economic puzzle. They can be very powerful and very destructive, but they're often not going to be enough to define the future of an economy by themselves. To thrive, Syria needed not just an absence of sanctions, but also an influx of cash. And with an extended charm offensive, Damascus did a pretty good job of securing that as well. On the humanitarian side, the European Union came in clutch, pledging something like 200 million euros over the course of 2025. Not enough by most estimates to meet anywhere near the entire need, but a significant influx at a time the country desperately needed it. Some of the Gulf states also stepped in to help underwrite the functioning of the Syrian government. We know the Saudis and Qataris stepped in to help fund public sector salaries in Syria, and Riyadh also abracadabraed Syria's debt to the World Bank to enable engagement to kick off again. Previously, Damascus was delinquent to the tune of millions of dollars there, but while the Syrian government may not have access to a huge amount of oil revenue, the Saudis do. As you might expect, the Turks have also been extremely active, pushing energy programs and investments while remaining militarily active in the north of the country. And then there was perhaps one of the two diciest diplomatic relationships Syria would have to handle, an engagement with Russia that, while weakened, had been a major military backer of the former Assad government and which still had bases, military hardware and personnel in the country. Let's be clear, especially at a social level, the amount of bad blood between the Syrians who would have backed HTS and the Russian Federation is in many cases solidly Baltic states or Poland tier. For years, Russia allegedly did a number of extremely YouTube-unfriendly things to various parts of the Syrian population, and when we saw convoys of Russian troops rapidly retreating to their bases after the takeover, with lines of HTS fighters and supporters along the streets, it appeared there was a genuine possibility that the Syrians would take some of the firepower they just captured from the Syrian Arab army and turn them against those Russian bases that now found themselves suddenly very isolated and a long way from home. Instead, Damascus appears to have embraced a different approach, one that one analyst I talked to described as muscular pragmatism. The Syrians now claim that during the offensive, after they'd taken Aleppo, they were contacted by the Russians who proposed a ceasefire arrangement, one that involved the front lines being frozen, with HTS keeping what they'd taken. That was apparently interpreted as a sign that Moscow knew Assad was failing and was making a diplomatic Hail Mary, and so the decision was made to push on. Once the victory was secured, though, the Syrians appear to have pivoted more towards a degree of conciliation. Shara has publicly said he wants to redefine ties with Russia and will honour many of Syria's previous agreements with Moscow. They would also apparently, after putting the squeeze on Russia's military presence and seeing many of those troops withdrawn, allow Russia to keep some security presence in the country, while it also came out that Russia would be providing support in a number of other areas. On one hand, Russia's come in clutch as a key supplier of some of the things Syria desperately needs, namely oil and food. And while at the same time Russia appears to have kept some of its military bases, it's not clear to me exactly how much use they're getting out of them. In 2025, for example, Russia's naval presence in the Mediterranean appears to have degraded significantly, with perhaps the most visible example of that being when the submarine Novorossiysk encountered severe mechanical difficulties and had to be taken under tow and dragged the long, long way back to Russian shipyards on the Baltic. Meanwhile, in Syria itself, there are places where the Russian military presence is at least comparatively still more intact. I think that adds into arguably the overarching theme for Syrian diplomacy since December 2024, which is straight pragmatism. The country, frankly, compared to someone like Iran, just doesn't have that many cards to play. The economy is devastated. Most of the resources aren't under the control of the government. The forces of HTS were strong enough to overthrow Assad, but that's not saying much. Against the likes of the IDF or any major regional actor, they'd likely struggle. And so perhaps in part to try and avoid becoming too much of a puppet to any one foreign power, the Syrian government has tried to work with just about everyone. The Americans, the Europeans, the Saudis, the Turks, and yes, in some cases, even the Russians, with the recurring theme being an attempt to try and balance different forces against each other. In October, for example, it was reported that al-Shara might even consider inviting Russia to send additional troops to southern Syria, some of whom it's entirely possible might have been fighting against his forces not that long before. The logic of doing that, this piece from the Carnegie Institute argues, might be to counterbalance Israeli forces, because while the IDF might not think twice about launching operations into Syria, they might be a tad more reluctant to blast Russian troops out of the way in order to do it. In the long term, how this diplomatic balancing act plays out really remains to be seen. But over the last 12 months, at least economically, a number of the signs have been promising. According to the UNHCR, between 8 December 2024 and 11 December 2025, roughly 1.28 million Syrians who had fled the country returned home. In many cases, those returning face a challenging humanitarian situation, but in large numbers, they are returning. And the Syrian economy, which began 2025 as a basket case, is still a basket case, but at least now it's one that's growing rather than shrinking. Initially, the World Bank estimated that in 2025, the Syrian economy would grow by perhaps 1% in real terms. But as it turns out, the growth that kicked off was considerably faster than that. The reconstruction task is likely to be immense. Over the course of the civil war, a lot of the country was reduced to rubble. But with the war over, at least the pace of reconstruction appears to be quickening. Over the last decade, the UN Development Programme reported they'd led efforts to clear about 2.1 million cubic metres of rubble in Syria. Now the plan is apparently to clear over 550,000 cubic metres in a couple of months. Of course, it's often true that it takes longer to rebuild a country than it does to destroy one. And we're talking about reversing the effects of more than a decade of war here. Plus, it has to be said, Syria and its new government still faces a variety of risks and threats. There have been sectarian clashes and violence. Al-Assad had been a member of Syria's Alawite sect, and there have been a number of flashpoints between the new government and the Alawites, especially along the Syrian coast. And there are also significant areas of Syria where central government control is pretty much a distant myth, from SDF-controlled areas in the northeast to zones where Israeli troops have moved into internationally recognised Syrian territory, and a long-rumoured agreement between Tel Aviv and Damascus, pushed for by the United States, has, at least so far, failed to eventuate. Basically, for everything that's gone right, there's a risk of something going horribly, horribly wrong. But this video isn't about what might happen in 2026, it's about what did happen in 2025. And in that respect, despite going into December 2024 in a deeply rough position, the Syrian story is one that at least shows signs of hope. And who knows? Perhaps after a 2025 that was punctuated by multiple conflicts breaking out and all kinds of weird international events, perhaps, just perhaps, 2026 will be a year of greater stability, with more slow-burning stories and dynamics for us to cover, and few dramatic international events that suddenly steal the headlines. Or, it could not be that. Welcome to 2026, everyone. I expect it's going to be an interesting one. And with that, let me give a bit of a channel update. First, I will freely admit that when I was first putting together this episode, there was going to be a section where I reflected a degree of hope that maybe, just maybe, 2026 might not be quite so dramatic internationally as 2025 was. Who knows, that might still be the case, but you can't pretend we're not off to an eventful start. That said, don't expect me to rush out the gate with coverage of Venezuela immediately. I expect the commentary there is going to be pretty much constant for the foreseeable future, but for my part, I'm hoping to let the fog clear a bit before we properly unpack the issue. So depending on how things play out and when I think enough information is available, it might be next week, it might be 3 weeks from now. I'm just flagging it to make clear that I'm not going to avoid the topic, just trying to make sure that when I do look at it, I have the best chance of doing it right. Moving on to just taking a bit of a backward look at 2025 then, I just wanted to say thank you for the ongoing support and engagement. This channel is really driven and has always been driven by the audience here on YouTube and those of you over on Patreon. And my plan is to make sure that always remains the case. One thing I didn't actually know about YouTube relatively early on is that every now and again you will get emails or offers from individuals or entities that say, hey, I'd like to buy a part or all of your channel. And that's flattering, but I'm just not interested. And so I figured as part of the end of year update, I should just make it abundantly clear that I never plan on giving any ownership or control of the channel away to anyone else. I consider it a real privilege to have this platform, to have the microphone, so to speak. And all I can say is that I hope that over the last year, I brought you information and content that you found useful and commit to try my best to do the same going into 2026. So thank you again, everyone. Welcome to the new year, and I'll see you next week.